What is the true story of the Great Wall of China? Welcome to Calapex, where history comes alive and every video immerses you in the destiny of those who have shaped the world. Today, prepare to cross the veil of time and follow the silent trail of a stone serpent stretching thousands of kilometers. From the Yellow Sea to the edges of the Gobi Desert, it stretches like a scar on the flank of China. It's called the Great Wall, but its history is much vaster, darker, and more mysterious than one might think. Built not in a day, nor by a single empire, but by entire generations of workers, soldiers, and emperors, the wall was never just a simple barrier. It was at various times a barrier, a tomb, a sacred border, and a tool of control. But before embarking on a new adventure, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss anything. Thank you, and have a great journey. The first traces of sedentary civilizations on the territory we now call China date back to the Neolithic period, around the 3rd millennium before Christ. During this pivotal time, two agricultural lifestyles emerged, notably the cultivation of millet in the northern plains and rice in the more humid regions of the south. The archaeological remains of the Yangshao culture, active from about 5,000 to 3,000, show a structured village organization, supported by millet production and the raising of domesticated animals. In the Yellow River Basin, the Longshan culture, which appeared around 3000, is already distinguished by highly refined pottery and advanced technicity in agriculture. Research suggests a society on the verge of social stratification, where the elaboration of polished black ceramics reflects increasingly sophisticated craftsmanship. Meanwhile, further south, the Hemudu culture, mainly located in what is now Zhejiang province, focused on the early domestication of rice, exploiting a humid and rainy climate. Objects discovered at Hemudu sites include wooden tools, stone blades, and rudimentary pottery, clearly intended for daily use. This diversity in subsistence modes already illustrates the profound adaptation of human groups to their respective environments. For the populations of the northern plains, a drier climate with marked temperature variations favored the production of millet, hardy and rich in nutrients, while in the south, the abundance of annual rainfall made it possible to flood the rice fields. The populations of these various sites lived in small communities, established in dwellings that were sometimes semi-subterranean, with vegetal roofs and cob walls. This rudimentary organization prefigured an emerging form of social hierarchy, centered around local chiefs and rituals dedicated to nature deities. Numerous remains also indicate early attempts to defend against external threats, whether due to resource conflicts or interclan tensions. Some defensive ditches, found notably at Longshan sites, suggest the beginnings of military specialization as the community endeavored to protect cereal stocks, crucial for survival, by using rammed earth structures. Thus, at the turn of the 3rd millennium before Christ, the first milestones of a civilization whose legacy would continue in later dynasties were emerging. Tombs excavated by archaeologists further revealed differentiated burial types, suggesting that an elite or ruling group was already imposing a certain protocol regarding ancestor worship. Painted ceramics, often decorated with animal and geometric motifs, could represent totemic beliefs or clan identity symbols. Through these multiple clues, we perceive that the Chinese Neolithic was not only a period of survival, but also the cradle of a genuine cultural dynamic, foreshadowing the great political and social structures that would gradually emerge. According to Chinese tradition, the Xia dynasty would be the first to have ruled over a significant portion of the territory we call China, although direct archaeological evidence of its existence remains a subject of debate today. According to ancient chronicles, such as the Shiji by Sima Qian, the emergence of the Xia is placed between 2070 and 1600. They depict a lineage of semi-legendary rulers, present in stories that oscillate between foundational myths and historical reality. At the heart of these tales sits the major figure of Yu the Great, a civilizing hero renowned for taming the devastating waters of the Yellow River. At that time, the Yellow River Valley, already the cradle of Neolithic cultures, was regularly subjected to massive floods, capable of destroying crops and villages. The stories of Yu the Great recount his determination to drain and channel the floods, not by brutally blocking them, but by guiding them through a network of canals. This technical feat, though partly legendary, symbolizes the early idea of humanity, not only seeking to survive in a capricious environment, but also to master it intelligently. Many historians see in this the early seeds of an organized state, where the coordination of hydraulic works required the mobilization of multiple communities. The myth of Yu the Great also illustrates the emergence of a collective mindset geared towards controlling nature. In the sources mentioning his story, emphasis is placed on the concerted efforts to contain the overflows, as the very perception of nature as an adversary to be circumscribed reflects a desire to dominate it, or at least to protect oneself from it. This conceptual legacy would leave a lasting mark on Chinese history, where the construction of dikes, walls, and canals is a recurring theme, going hand in hand with the rise of the first centralized political entities. On the material level, some sites located in the Henan province are sometimes attributed to the Xia period, although their dating remains questionable. These sites contain foundations of primitive palaces, tombs with simplified ritual objects, and traces of rudimentary defensive ditches. However, the very existence of a hereditary central power concentrated in the hands of a single clan remains poorly established. Nonetheless, the importance accorded to the figure of Yu and the struggle against floods underscores the idea that, from ancient times, the control of water and the collective management of territory were already factors of legitimacy for leaders eager to inscribe themselves in tradition. Ultimately, the Xia dynasty occupies a gray area between myth and real history. However, it foreshadows the rise of political forces capable of unifying vast regions around grandiose projects, such as the domestication of the Yellow River. The epics and stories surrounding Yu the Great reveal a fundamental trait of Chinese identity. Indeed, the persistent idea that prosperity depends on the ingenious mastery of an often hostile environment, and that the power of a sovereign is measured by his ability to protect his community from the vagaries of nature. After the semi-legendary era of the Xia, the Shang dynasty, which flourished around 1600 to 1046, marks the first political entity solidly attested by archaeology. Excavations at Yin, near present-day Anyang, have uncovered vast palaces, rich royal tombs, and above all, an abundance of bronze artifacts. This civilization is distinguished by its remarkable mastery of metallurgy, reflected in ritual vessels adorned with stylized motifs. Such bronzes were used notably to honor ancestors and to assert the power of the ruling elite. In parallel, the Shang left behind thousands of oracle bones, on which are engraved the earliest forms of Chinese writing identified to date. These bones, generally ox scapulae or turtle shells, provide information on the daily and religious concerns of the Shang court. The inscriptions, called oracle bone script, cover a range of topics such as harvests, wars, sacrifices, or astronomical predictions. Each carving reflects a fascination with divination, practiced by diviners who interpreted the cracks formed by fire. This form of archaic writing lays the foundation for scriptural evolution in China, one notable feature of which is the relative continuity in the form and meaning of the characters. The Zhou dynasty, which succeeded the Shang around 1046 before Christ, disrupted the established order by claiming the mandate of heaven, meaning the divine legitimacy to rule. The Western Zhou, from 1046 to 771, before Christ, settled in the Central Plains and consolidated a feudal system based on principalities allocated to loyal nobles. Under their reign, bronze metallurgy remained a marker of prestige, while rituals and writing systems continued to be structured. This period also saw the emergence of fortified city-states made of rammed earth, a technique consisting of successively compacting layers of wet earth to erect solid and durable enclosures. The use of rammed earth addressed a defensive imperative in a context where rivalries between lineages were increasing. The remains of these fortifications, sometimes adorned with moats, demonstrate a more elaborate military organization than in previous eras, while highlighting the need to protect political and religious centers. In the Haojing region, near present-day Xi'an, traces of the Western Zhou capital can be found, illustrating the growing sophistication of urban planning and administration. Commercial exchanges intensified along the main river routes, allowing the circulation of bronze, jade, and other luxury goods destined for the nobles. Simultaneously, the cult of ancestors took on considerable importance, symbolizing the supremacy of family values and the continuity of a dynastic tradition. It is in this melting pot of cultures, technical innovations, and political rivalries that Chinese civilization slowly gained its foundations, blending ancient beliefs, courtly arts, and proto-bureaucratic structures that would pave the way for future imperial centralizations. Through this long interval from the 3rd to the early 1st millennium before Christ, China, although geographically distant, did not evolve in isolation. Historians often adopt a comparative perspective, highlighting the innovations and parallel developments that emerged in other cradles of civilization. In Mesopotamia, the famous Code of Hammurabi, engraved in Akkadian on a basalt stele around 1750 before Christ, reflects an advanced level of legal organization and centralization of power. The ziggurats, immense stepped temples erected in cities like Ur or Uruk, illustrate the religious and architectural sophistication of the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. In Egypt, during the 3rd and 2nd millennia before Christ, the Old Kingdom, famous for its monumental pyramids, was followed by the Middle Kingdom and then the New Kingdom, whose pharaohs extended their influence to Nubia and the Levant. The pyramids of Giza, built around 2600 before Christ, testify to an extraordinary organizational capacity, as well as a deep investment in the belief in the afterlife. At the same time, the Nile is for Egypt what the Yellow River is for China, a vital artery, a source of fertility and prosperity, but also sometimes of brutal destruction in the event of excessive flooding. Further east, the Indus civilization, centered on cities like Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, gradually declined around 1900 before Christ after developing complex irrigation networks and a remarkable urban uniformity. The reasons for this decline remain debated, with climate changes, invasions, or shifts in river courses possibly having weakened this pioneering society in urban planning and carnelian craftsmanship. In the Mediterranean basin, the cities of the Mycenaean culture emerged in Greece around 1600 before Christ, laying the foundations for what would later become Hellenic civilization. Fortified palaces, such as those of Mycenae and Pylos, housed a warrior aristocracy, while the script known as Linear B indicates the beginnings of palatial administration. At the turn of the 8th century before Christ, China undergoes a decisive phase of transition. Once unified under the authority of the Western Zhou, it gradually shifts towards a constellation of rival principalities. This era, known as the Spring and Autumn Period, or Chunqiu, gets its name from the Spring and Autumn Annals, the official chronicle of the state of Lu, renowned for its meticulous compilation of political and military events. In a world where the notion of a Chinese empire is still in its gestation, regional powers are strengthening while central authority weakens. The accounts and archaeological remains of this period, roughly spanning from 771 to 453 before Christ, reveal a major transformation. The wall, later a symbol of unified China, is then limited to local constructions, sometimes called fangcheng, scattered and not interconnected. Understanding this historical moment requires revisiting the fall of the Western Zhou, the multiple military advancements, and the geopolitical situation of the rest of the world. To better grasp the dynamics of the period, one must first mention the collapse of the western branch of the Zhou. This lineage, founded in the 11th century before Christ after the victory over the Qin Dynasty, had established its capital near Xi'an, in what is now the Shanxi province. However, in 771 before Christ, a memorable event hastens the end of their supremacy. According to the records, King Zhou Yuwang neglects his ritual obligations and alienates the border nobles. Taking advantage of this weakness, tribes from the northwest, sometimes referred to as Quanrong, launch an offensive against the capital Haojing. The attack is so brutal that the region can hardly mount any solid resistance. The royal city is devastated, ritual structures are destroyed, and King Yuwang perishes in combat. Faced with the growing insecurity, the surviving Zhou nobles choose to move the court eastward to the city of Luoyang, located in today's Henan province. This transfer symbolizes the fracture. Power is no longer anchored in the historical western lands, but attempts to rely on the east, considered more stable. However, the new eastern Zhou court exerts only limited influence. The multiple Chinese states, once devoted vassals, consolidate to form truly independent principalities. This erosion of central authority results in political fragmentation. Henceforth, many aristocratic groups vie for prestige, lands, and resources, all while nominally claiming Zhou legitimacy. But in reality, the royal court is no longer able to compel or unify them under a common project. This weakening sets the stage for a period of instability, ephemeral alliances, and successive conflicts. This reconfiguration puts diplomacy between rival states at the forefront. Song, Jin, Lu, Qi, Chu, and Zheng each strive to seize as much territory as possible or to influence their neighbors. Often, small principalities find themselves under the sway of more powerful entities, or they change allies depending on military circumstances. Contrary to the image of a territory unified under imperial tradition, we witness here a fragmentation where each state develops its political practices, sometimes divergent, while maintaining the illusion of a hierarchy respectful of the Zhou dynasty. On a cultural and ritual level, Luoyang still holds some symbolic prestige. However, in military reality, it no longer dictates the general order. Conditions are thus ripe for the multiplication of local conflicts, where the need for protection begins to manifest through the construction of rudimentary defensive lines. It is in this context of incessant rivalries that various military innovations emerge aimed at ensuring a state's supremacy over its neighbors. Long before the era of great continuous walls, the focus is on mobility and tactical efficiency. The crossbow, possibly appearing at the end of the Western Zhou period, is then perfected and revolutionizes the way of fighting. It indeed offers a greater range than a traditional bow and increased shooting power, becoming a significant asset during plain battles or sieges of small fortified enclaves. Moreover, its mechanism, combining lever and pin, requires some mastery, which compels aristocrats to train specialized units composed of professional soldiers. The writing on bones and bronzes from this time regularly mentions the strategic role of these new weapons, and sometimes describes the advantages they provide in military campaigns. In parallel, horse harnessing is spreading more widely, following practices already observed under the Shang and then the Western Zhou. The horse, long a symbol of nobility and prestige, is now hitched to war chariots or used for light cavalry, allowing for surprise attacks on the adversary and rapid movement over vast territories. Progress in metallurgy, particularly thanks to rudimentary steel and high-quality bronze, allows for the production of sturdy parts to secure the shafts and wheels of chariots. In some states, war leaders distinguish themselves by their ability to mobilize cavalry units capable of striking before any enemy regrouping. Strategic treaties, remnants of which can be gleaned from written tradition, emphasize the importance of discipline within these troops and the necessity of coordinating infantry, chariots, and crossbowmen. This period is sometimes dubbed the era of the 100 rival kingdoms, as the number of more or less influential principalities is significant. However, not all are equal, as some, like the powerful state of Jin in the north or Chu further south, possess abundant natural resources and superior organizational skills, ensuring the prosperity of their armies. Others, more modest, are forced to ally with a more imposing neighbor or limit themselves to passive defense. This mosaic fosters new ideas. In fact, experienced generals, military artisans, and strategists begin to theorize the relationship between fortifications, troop movements, and offensive capabilities. Without going to the extent of erecting a continuous long wall, each city builds its own bastions or equips itself with sophisticated defense tools. In this competition, any technological advancement can change the game, and the fear of an enemy exploiting an innovation drives each state to perfect its arsenal. Investment in defensive engineering is particularly evident along contested borders. The Fangcheng, literally square fortifications or border walls, first appear in strategic regions like the boundary between the territories of Zheng and Chu or around the state of Qi. Often, these forts or walls are made of rammed earth. Regular foundations are dug, then layer upon layer of earth and gravel is compacted using wooden tampers to achieve a dense and resistant structure. According to records, these beaten earth lines are already called walls, or changcheng in some writings, even if they do not reach the monumentality or continuity of the structures later associated with the Great Wall. Their main function is to slow down the advance of a potential invader and to alert the defenders. Often, watchtowers, tiny compared to what would be seen later, punctuate these fortifications. The sentinels observe the horizon, using smoke signals or drums to warn of an approaching enemy army. However, it is not a unified system linking all principalities. Each state designs its own setup, which can vary in thickness, height, or length, depending on local resources. In some regions, local authorities prefer wooden palisades or simple ditches, deemed sufficient to deter small raids. In others, true walls made of raw earth are erected, intended for more permanent protection against a regular adversary. The basic materials, primarily the earth from the surrounding subsoil, are abundant and easy to use, but require a considerable workforce. Yet, in a time marked by fragmentation, each entity demands more and more peasants for its armies and civil projects. Corvée labor, imposed on the local populations, becomes an instrument of authority. By forcing peasants to work on fort construction, the state imposes its control over them and strengthens its power. On a purely technical level, this rammed earth, resulting from a traditional method called hangtu or hangtu, forms the foundation of Chinese fortifications for centuries. Already, the idea of linear defense is taking shape, and securing trade corridors, or essential passages for economic survival, becomes a vital concern. Political tensions thus incite each state to consolidate its margins, fearing the expansionist ambitions of its neighbors. Furthermore, these initial walls, although discontinuous, contribute to the strategic culture in gestation. Military formations get accustomed to crossing or bypassing these obstacles, while their builders refine consolidation techniques. Archives sometimes mention that if one of the small kingdoms managed to erect several successive rows of walls, it was considered practically impregnable by attackers without advanced siege machines. That said, these lines of defense remain local, and there is not yet talk of a grand imperial project to protect the entire Chinese territory. It will take decades or even centuries, and especially the rise of a hegemonic state capable of coordinating the effort to see more imposing walls emerge. While the spring and autumn period in China is marked by fragmentation and the development of rudimentary fortifications, the outside world is also undergoing great transformations. In the Near East, the Assyrian Empire reaches its peak. Under powerful kings such as Tiglath-Pileser III or Sargon II, the Assyrians control a vast territory stretching from Mesopotamia to the Levant and impose a massive tribute on their vassals. This system of domination relies on the use of formidable professional armies, equipped with war chariots and formidable archers. The Assyrians also build fortifications in their opulent city-states, but their mastery of siege and pitched battle allows them to expand rapidly. Their military prowess frightens neighboring populations, especially as the deportation of conquered peoples is part of their policy, creating movement and mixing of populations, as shown by the bas-reliefs of their palaces decorated with military scenes. Further west in the Mediterranean basin, the Phoenicians develop a vast network of colonies, originating from the cities of Tyre, Sidon, or Byblos, located in present-day Lebanon. These renowned navigators found trading posts all around the Mediterranean Sea, including Carthage towards the end of the 9th century before Christ E. Their maritime domination is based on a keen sense of commerce and an efficient fleet, while China, in its relative isolation, focuses on its internal wars. The Phoenicians spread their alphabet, sell luxury products such as purple dye, and contribute to the rise of intercontinental exchanges. The resulting commercial and cultural interactions lay the foundations for future Mediterranean civilizations, whose heritage Greece and Rome will inherit. At the same time, in the vast plains of Central Asia and the border regions of northern and northwestern China, the first great nomadic peoples emerge, including the Proto-Scythians and the Yuezhi. These pastoral confederations, adept at cavalry, possess impressive mobility, and live off livestock, loot acquired during raids, and occasional trade with sedentary communities. The Proto-Scythians, linked to the Pontic steppes, introduce an animalistic art style and develop rapid combat tactics based on the composite bow and mastery of the horse. Later, these techniques will influence the future steppe peoples, such as the Xiongnu and the Mongols, who will directly challenge larger-scale wall constructions. The Yuezhi, for their part, will disperse over time and intervene in Chinese history, by moving westward, contributing to upheavals in transcontinental exchanges. In light of this global panorama, the China of the spring and autumn period is not alone in grappling with a context of political changes and rivalries. Still, cultural pathways between China and these distant powers remain poorly documented at this time, largely due to geographical distances and a lack of structured trade routes. The future communication routes, later associated with the Silk Road, are still just occasional paths taken by isolated caravans. Yet, nomadic migrations and echoes of distant inventions slowly circulate, encouraging a gradual evolution of military practices and artisanal knowledge. Also, in the decades and centuries to follow, the regional Chinese fortifications, initially designed to guard against raids from neighboring states, will take on an expanded significance as nomadic threats intensify. In the mid-5th century before Christi, China experienced a historical phase often referred to as the Warring States period. It spans approximately from 453 to 221 before Christi and follows an earlier era known as the Spring and Autumn period. For an international audience unfamiliar with this chronology, it is crucial to note that the title Warring States is not merely a figure of speech. It describes a context where several states, born from the fragmentation of the Zhou dynasty, were in constant competition to dominate the Central Plain and secure their borders. This oppressive rivalry led to an intensification of defensive measures, including the construction of preliminary walls, or more precisely, long separate walls, ancestors of the future unified Great Wall. The political fragmentation of China at the time is partly explained by a sudden increase in population. This burgeoning demography found its origins in several agricultural innovations introduced at the end of the Spring and Autumn period. Agrarian reforms allowed peasants to exploit lands more efficiently, thanks notably to the generalization of iron tools, which gradually replaced bronze instruments. Iron, being more robust and easier to produce in large quantities, helped increase field yields, as it was used to make more efficient plowshares, more effective hoes, and other more resistant farming tools. In parallel, the use of ox-drawn plows gradually spread. This technique, although likely existing quietly before the Warring States period, saw decisive growth as states realized the crucial necessity of increasing grain production. The ox-drawn plow facilitated the tilling of larger and deeper lands. The combination of iron tools and animal traction significantly reduced the hardship of labor and freed up hands for other tasks, including military defense. Indeed, as the agrarian economy was the basis of the wealth of a traditional Chinese state, good rural productivity meant the possibility of maintaining larger and better equipped armies. This demographic growth also had effects on the organization of space. As the population expanded into fertile but remote regions, rivers and streams served as transportation routes, not only for food, but also for goods. At the same time, sovereigns feared that bands of nomads or border enemies might threaten crops in remote communities. Efforts were then made to secure these areas sustainably, hence the growing necessity to build defensive structures, sometimes rudimentary at first, which evolved into a succession of walls and fortifications. These constructions, initially designed to protect new fields, already signaled the strategic importance of a fortified frontier. In this political and economic ferment, the great kingdoms that would mark Chinese history emerged from the shadows. Traditionally, 7 main ones are counted, notably Qin, Zhao, Yan, Wei, Han, Qi, and Chu. Other entities existed, such as the small kingdoms of Song and Zhongshan, but they had less long-term influence than what are today called the 7 hegemons of the Warring States period. Each of these states, jealous of its independence and power, sought to combine 2 strategies to survive. These were offense for conquering new lands and defense for protecting its territory against enemy incursions. In these regions, the threat did not only come from immediate neighbors. The Xiongnu, a vast ensemble of nomadic peoples established in the north, conducted, depending on the seasons, raids to seize livestock or grain, sometimes devastating the outskirts of sedentary states. Chinese sources of the era describe these steppe populations as skilled horsemen, experts in horseback archery, and capable of quickly swooping down on a border village, then disappearing into the wild plains. The kingdoms of Qin, Zhao, and Yan, located in the northern part of the Chinese space, were particularly confronted with these pressures. The most well-known response today was the construction of Changcheng. In Chinese, this term literally translates to long wall or long rampart. During the Warring States period, these Changcheng remained fragmented and did not constitute a single structure stretching for thousands of kilometers, as would later be the case under the unified Qin Dynasty and then under the Ming. Each kingdom built its own segment to defend its borders. To the north, Zhao built compacted earth walls to enclose most of its cultivated lands and to slow down the Xiongnu horsemen. Yan opted for fortified lines to protect its access to the sea and its inland territories. Finally, Qin, to the west, also favored defensive structures intended not only to counter nomadic attacks, but also the hostility of the rival states Wei and Han further east. These walls, often made of rammed earth, using a technique called pise, where wet earth was compacted between formwork, did not yet have the monumentality of the Great Wall visited today. Nevertheless, the idea was already based on creating a continuous, or nearly continuous, obstacle to control movement. The fortified gates were equipped with guard posts and watchtowers to quickly alert inner garrisons in case of an incursion. This dynamic later reflected the desire to unify, under the Qin Dynasty founded by Ying, the various sections into a single structure. However, at that time, it was still within the framework of independent states, wanting only to protect their own domains. While in the collective imagination, the Chinese wall is a long ribbon of bricks, winding along the crests, one must place oneself in the context of the 4th and 3rd centuries before Christ to understand the actual state of defensive technology. The Warring States developed a whole range of innovations that made these walls, despite their less spectacular appearance than those of later eras, very effective structures for the time. First, a network of watchtowers was built at regular intervals. The aim was to achieve maximum visibility over the surrounding terrain. Sentinels were permanently stationed to monitor enemy movements. In the presence of a threat, they would light a fire or raise a column of smoke. This communication system by signals was particularly valuable in a China still devoid of a unified postal system and messengers on horseback over long distances. The smoke signals propagated in a cascade. From one tower, the message was passed to the next, then to the next again, and within a few hours, an alert could be relayed over several hundred kilometers. Next, angled walkways were designed to allow soldiers to move more easily along the top of the wall, especially at turning points or in naturally steep areas. Internal staircases were also erected, sometimes in wood, to quickly access the wall's crest. This configuration facilitated defense, as soldiers could converge where the enemy attempted a breakthrough. The archers, stationed on the walls, simultaneously gained a wider shooting angle. Finally, the refinement of the crossbow, which appeared in previous centuries, radically changed the art of war in these fortifications. Where the traditional bow demanded great skill, the crossbow provided a stable projection power and was easier for a less trained soldier to handle. Thanks to the presence of merlins and crenellations, defending from a wall became less perilous. One could shoot in relative safety, sheltered from enemy arrows. This defensive system was therefore based on a coherent whole, notably elevated rammed earth walls, watchtowers for vigilance, smoke signals for alert, and long-range shooting devices to repel brutal attacks. Despite the climate of nearly constant wars, diplomacy was far from absent. The rulers of the warring states engaged in intense negotiations to form alliances, negotiate truces, or, conversely, secretly encourage their rivals' enemies to launch raids. Spies played a key role in these maneuvers. The intelligence gathered on the state of fortifications, the morale of opposing troops, or even internal politics, could make the difference between a swift victory and an embarrassing rout. Some mercenaries became spies for the benefit of this or that kingdom. Once infiltrated, they reported valuable information about the actual strength of the walls, the number of garrisons stationed along a section, and the layout of the watchtowers. Treaties negotiated during this period sometimes included clauses limiting the deployment of fortifications in certain regions, or, conversely, permitting reconstruction. The challenge for each state was to prevent its opponents from gaining a strategic advantage while attempting to preserve its own defensive advantages. Furthermore, the construction of walls also had a strong symbolic dimension. Possessing a long, imposing wall, adorned with watchposts, visible from afar, demonstrated a state's financial power and its determination to protect itself against external threats. The historical annals of the time describe with admiration the capacity of a kingdom to mobilize thousands of workers to raise these ramparts in a relatively short time. The expertise required to shape and compact the earth and to erect fortified gates reflected the existence of an advanced administrative organization. Thus, the walls gradually became an intangible legacy, representing the power and grandeur of a state capable of standing as a barrier against any potential aggressor. However, it is not an exaggeration to say that Chinese rulers were already aware, to varying degrees, of the limitations of a wall's effectiveness on its own. Alliances, diplomacy, and military intelligence complemented static defense. Moreover, some kings, such as the famous King Wuling of Zhao, around 325 before Christ, adopted military reforms aimed at troop versatility. For instance, Zhao integrated cavalry tactics inspired by nomadic peoples to respond more flexibly to rapid incursions while maintaining protective walls. Thus, we can see that the role of the Changcheng was not absolute. They were part of a broader array of defensive and offensive means. To place the Warring States period in a global context, it is necessary to look at what was happening simultaneously on other continents. At the same time, Greece was entering its classical phase. The beginning of the Peloponnesian Wars can be dated to 431 before Christ, when Sparta confronted Athens in a prolonged conflict. This conflict exhausted the Greek city-states until 404 before Christ. Despite these internal struggles, Greek culture shone through philosophy with Socrates and Plato, tragedy with Sophocles and Euripides, as well as art with sculptures and architecture like the Parthenon. However, the cities were left weakened by the end of these hostilities, providing Philip II of Macedonia, starting in 359 before Christ, with the opportunity to gradually subdue the Greek world. His son, Alexander the Great, would later lead campaigns that would reshape the map of the Near East. The Achaemenid Persian Empire, founded by Cyrus II in the 6th century before Christ and consolidated by his successors Cambyses II, Darius I, and Xerxes I, reached its territorial peak in the 5th century before Christ. At that time, it stretched from Asia Minor, present-day Turkey, to the borders of India. A colossal and multilingual power, the Persian Empire built great networks of roads and an extremely efficient imperial postal system. However, in the 4th century before Christ, this entity came into direct contact with Macedonia. After Xerxes' attempt to invade Greece at the beginning of the 5th century, the situation reversed. Alexander, son of Philip II, set out to conquer the Persian world in 334. Before Christ, and in just a few years, he ended the Achaemenid dynasty. Alexander's conquests reached Egypt, Mesopotamia, Central Asia, and crossed the Indus. His empire, although ephemeral, deeply influenced the conquered regions by spreading Hellenistic culture. Meanwhile, northern India is characterized by the Mahajanapadas, which are large kingdoms or republics that consolidated from the 6th century before Christ. Among these, Mahajanapadas are Magadha, Kosala, and Vajji. In this context, nascent Buddhism is spreading, driven by the teachings of Siddhartha Gautama, better known as the Buddha. Originating from the Shakya clan, the Buddha is believed to have lived in the 6th century before Christ and attained enlightenment before spreading his doctrine, focused on the quest to end suffering. These kingdoms of northern India, located along the Ganges, also experienced political tensions and successive conquests, paving the way for the emergence of larger empires like the Maurya Empire, founded around 321 before Christ by Chandragupta Maurya. At the turn of the 3rd century before Christ, China is fragmented among several powers competing for supremacy. After a long phase of conflicts, the state of Qin, located in the west, succeeds in conquering all rival kingdoms and forging the first unified empire in Chinese history. This unification, led by Ying Zheng, who would take the name Qin Shi Huangdi, is accompanied by an unprecedented series of political, economic, and military innovations. Simultaneously, the power decides to connect and extend various existing defensive sections, thus laying the groundwork for what would later become the Great Wall, properly speaking. During this short but decisive period, from 221 to 206 before Christ, China undergoes a radical change, with administrative reforms and the fusion of multiple frontier barriers announcing the birth of an unprecedented imperial structure. At the same time, other civilizations, from the Near East to the Mediterranean, are also experiencing profound upheavals. Here's how this conjuncture led to the creation of a vast defensive project, intimately linked to the rise and the will for homogenization of the new ruler, Qin Shi Huangdi. Ying Zheng's accession to the throne of the state of Qin occurs in 246 before Christ, when he is but a teenager. Surrounded by formidable advisors such as Li Si, he nonetheless inherits a favorable territorial situation, as Qin had already adopted military and administrative reforms during the previous century. The essential objective is to surpass the other kingdoms, including Zhao, Wei, Han, Chu, Yan, and Qi, to establish Qin's hegemony. After a few years of internal consolidation and cleverly negotiated alliances, Ying Zheng embarks on an extremely methodical expansion campaign. In each conquered kingdom, he imposes Qin's organization, based on a disciplined army, the use of the population's labor force, and administration by loyal officials. In 221 before Christ, after having eliminated the last pockets of resistance, Yingzheng proclaims himself Shi Huangdi, which literally means First Emperor. Through this unprecedented title, he breaks with the feudal tradition to assert centralized power. Very quickly, he launches a series of measures to standardize the new empire. Monetary unification results in the adoption of a single coin shape, pierced by a central hole, to facilitate transport on strings. Weights and measures also undergo strict standardization, and unique standards are defined for measuring volume, length, and weight to ease fiscal barriers and commercial exchanges. More subtly, writing becomes the subject of a major harmonization project. Indeed, a standardized graphic style, called the small seal or xiaozhuan, becomes the imposed form for transcribing the administrative language. In the wake of these standardizations, Qin Shi Huangdi orchestrates an episode called the Burning of the Books. Fearing local intellectual traditions or thoughts considered divergent from the imperial doctrine, the emperor decrees the burning of numerous writings, except for books related to agriculture, medicine, or technical oracles deemed useful to the regime. Li Si, his chancellor, justifies this policy by arguing the necessity of eradicating sources of discord and preserving imperial authority from any criticism. This radical act, combined with the reputed burying alive of opposing scholars, contributes to Qin Shi Huangdi's dark legend as an authoritarian ruler. However, for the first time in Chinese history, a whole set of norms, whether it be language, currency, or taxation rules, is unified over a vast territory, laying the foundations for a coherent administration. In this endeavor, the desire to control the border space against nomadic peoples becomes of paramount importance, hence the necessity to invest in a vast program of interconnecting existing walls. Long before unification under Qin, several kingdoms in the north and northeast had begun erecting massive fortifications to protect themselves from Xiongnu nomadic incursions or to isolate from their immediate neighbors. The Zhao and the Yan, in particular, had developed extensive rammed earth walls, some sections of which crossed difficult-to-access mountainous areas. By incorporating these conquered states, Qin Shi Huangdi inherits a heterogeneous defensive legacy. To prevent any risk of internal rebellion, and above all, to repel external threats, the emperor undertakes to connect these multiple sections into an immense continuous structure, the Long Wall. Although this ultimate realization does not yet correspond to the brick silhouette associated today with the Great Wall, it marks a decisive milestone in the conception of consolidated borders under the authority of a central government. Ancient estimates report about 5,000 kilometers of combined walls, although these figures remain subject to discussion. The predominant construction method is rammed earth. In fact, wooden formworks are built in which layers of earth mixed with gravel are compacted. This ancient technique, already in use during the Zhou times, offers the advantage of being quick and mobilizing large amounts of local materials without necessitating costly transport. In some sections deemed strategic, such as mountain passes or ridges likely to channel significant invasions, stone facings reinforce the structure and protect the rammed earth from erosion. Moreover, regular guard posts and a few watchtowers are added to monitor enemy troop movements or signal any suspicious increase in nomadic presence. The workforce assembled for such tasks is colossal. It consists primarily of conscripts, recruited throughout the empire via a system of mandatory corvée labor. Often, peasants are forced to leave their fields to join these public utility work sites, under the supervision of officers appointed by the imperial court. The particularly harsh working conditions have fueled numerous legendary accounts of the sufferings endured. Moreover, the Qin Empire does not hesitate to employ prisoners of war or criminals sentenced to forced exile. Despite extreme conditions and strict oversight, these legions of builders are active in extending and merging the existing walls. In the mind of Qin Shi Huangdi, this defensive project is not merely a purely military work. It is the tangible sign of imperial power, a symbol meant to discourage both external peoples and potential internal plots. Thus, this phase of merging the ancient sections outlines the draft of a northern frontier still far from its final form, but already impressive due to its unprecedented extent. To successfully carry out the grand defensive project and manage an empire of unprecedented dimensions, the Qin regime deploys a particularly elaborate logistics network. Before even considering building or linking walls, massive amounts of resources need to be transported, including tools, construction materials, food for thousands of workers and soldiers, as well as livestock for transportation. Qin Shi Huangdi knows that the key to the longevity of his empire lies in the smooth flow and strict coordination of the entire network. With this in mind, the state invests massively in the construction or improvement of imperial roads, amplifying what was already tentatively initiated by the previous Qin kings. At the heart of this system are road relays installed at regular intervals, responsible for providing lodging, food, and replacement horses. These support points enable imperial emissaries and military officers to travel swiftly to deliver orders, reports, and directives. At the same time, the presence of these relays on strategic routes facilitates the transportation to the Great Wall construction sites. Built upon these bases are grain depots, true imperial granaries, where the supplies needed for the mobilized populations are stored. The more fertile agricultural regions located around the Yellow River Basin regularly send shipments of cereals to these warehouses. Thanks to a well-oiled organization, the central authority can then distribute food to the distant work sites, ensuring that shortages and famines among workers are minimized. In addition, efforts are made to improve geographical knowledge, and cartography becomes a major domain of interest. Until then, each kingdom had its own field data, often heterogeneous and incomplete. Under Qin, there is an attempt to create unified maps to better understand the terrain, distances, and positions of fortified points. Officials on mission, equipped with tablets and measuring gauges, record the measurements to relay them to the central administration. Thus, engineers sent on-site adjust the defensive routes, taking into account the topographical contours, nearby water sources, and deposits of soil or building stones. This interest in cartography goes beyond the narrow military framework. Qin Shi Huangdi wishes to assess all exploitable resources of the empire, whether they be iron mines, stone quarries, or forest areas. In this vast logistical setup, everything converges to make the wall a major issue, as defending and extending it requires agile resupply and perfect control of the roads. The relative success of these grand works testifies to the ability of Qin emperors to mobilize a considerable part of the population while maintaining a sense of order through the standardization of material culture and the writing system. Ancient sources also suggest that regular, even unexpected, inspections were conducted by imperial emissaries, ensuring close monitoring of local contractors and soldiers. This tightly knit administrative network, combined with the fear inspired by severe penalties imposed on any shortcomings, guarantees the solidity of the imperial logistical infrastructure. If the unification of China under the Qin Dynasty constitutes a major regional event, it also takes place in an international context in full transformation. By the end of the 3rd century before Christ, several remarkable civilizations were undergoing or initiating sometimes dramatic transformations. To the west, in Egypt, the Ptolemaic dynasty, founded following the conquests of Alexander the Great, still maintained control of the kingdom but was beginning to decline. Internal strife and the growing influence of foreign powers heralded the progressive end of Ptolemaic sovereignty, which would definitively fall under Roman control in the 1st century before Christ. In the Italian peninsula, the Roman Republic was in a phase of dynamic expansion. Rome, having subdued various Etruscan cities and defeated the Carthaginian power at the conclusion of the Punic Wars, which would begin as early as 264 before Christ, extended its influence around the Mediterranean Sea. While direct communication between Rome and China remained very limited at this time, the emergence of two future imperial poles could already be sensed, at least geopolitically. Historians consider the rise of the Roman Republic and the consolidation of the Qin and Han Empire that followed to mark two parallel trajectories that would eventually touch, several centuries later, through increasingly sustained trade exchanges. It is in the northwest of China that the outline of what would later be called the Silk Road is emerging. In the time of the Qin, long before the exploratory mission of Zhang Qian under the Han Dynasty, caravans already existed, taking various steppe routes to transport precious goods. Silk, renowned for its unmatched fineness, attracted the covetousness of many nomadic societies, and jade, extracted in the western regions, was a prestige object in Chinese culture for millennia. There is, therefore, the outline of a trade network connecting the Far East to the intermediate zones of Central Asia, even if commerce remained sporadic and primarily conducted through local tribes with contacts across several civilization centers. These early exchanges also influenced the priorities of the Qin government, and the need to secure trade routes and levy taxes was part of the motivations underlying the consolidation of walls in the northern border regions. The nomads of the steppes were not only seen as potential invaders, but also as useful intermediaries when order prevailed and alliances were struck. However, the fear of destructive raids prevailed, leading Qin Shi Huangdi to erect more robust defenses, symbolized by the merging of disparate walls, to protect the precious exchanges of silk and jade. By connecting these different parts of the world, we better perceive the scope of Qin unification. While Ptolemaic Egypt wavers and Rome gradually extends its domination, China takes a decisive step towards an imperial form. The construction or connection of a gigantic rampart intended to contain northern threats accompanies a series of administrative reforms that seal the end of the Warring States era. In a few decades, the political map of East Asia is redrawn in favor of an unprecedented authority, that of Qin Shi Huangdi. Even though the Qin dynasty would fall by 206 before Christ, giving way to the powerful Han dynasty, the institutional legacy and the foundations of the wall would remain. The age of imperial centralization had now opened, and the outside world would observe, often from a distance, the rise of a vast empire in Asia, marked by cultural influences, luxury goods exchanges, and the necessity of maintaining a colossal defensive system. At the decisive turning point of 206 before Christ, after the fall of the Qin dynasty, a new empire emerges on the territory we now call China, the Han dynasty. Founded by Liu Bang, who became Emperor Gaozu, it extends until 220 Anno Domini and corresponds to one of the most significant periods in Chinese history. During these 4 centuries, the Han state not only consolidates the administrative and cultural foundations left by the Qin, but also develops a wide network of diplomatic and commercial contacts that extends to the Middle East and, indirectly, to Europe. At the heart of this process lies a transforming border structure. The wall takes a decisive step in its long evolution. To defend the northern margins, control the movement of goods, and assert its prestige, The Han court undertakes to transform and extend the sections inherited from the previous era. Between architectural innovations, military strategies, and diplomatic alliances, the Han Dynasty thus inaugurates the second age of the Great Wall while opening a gateway to Central Asia and beyond. When the Han Dynasty consolidates its power, the wall upon which it casts its attention is not a creation ex nihilo. It builds upon the different fortifications of the north, inherited from the warring states from 453 before Christ, and partially unified under the preceding Qin. During this first Han phase, often considered the period of the two Han, the Western Han and Eastern Han, the authorities focused their efforts on transforming the structure into a more coherent rampart. It is no longer just disparate ramparts, but a systematic defensive belt, especially in the areas most exposed to nomadic incursions. Technically, the Han Wall still rests on rammed earth, a mix of compacted earth, but more widely introduces stone, and sometimes brick in certain crucial sections. Arranging the stone allows for greater robustness, while brick, although costly to produce and transport, offers a notable gain in terms of stability. The imperial workshops begin to mass-produce enormous quantities of well-calibrated bricks, which are then sent to the construction sites. In regions where stone is scarce, they remain faithful to rammed earth, but the formwork becomes more methodical, allowing the construction of walls several meters high and thick. The watchtowers are also redesigned, and more floors are added in some frontier fortresses to better monitor the horizon. One of the major reinforcement axes is located in the Hexi Corridor, also called the Gansu Corridor, a long strip of land connecting northern China to the confines of Central Asia. This geographical area, nestled between the Qilian Mountains to the south and the Beishan Mountains to the north, opens the way to the Tarim Basin located in present-day Xinjiang. It is an unavoidable passage for anyone wanting to head west, and therefore holds vital strategic interest. The Han authorities build an extension of the wall here to secure this corridor, frequented by caravanners or nomadic tribes. Garrisons are established, equipped with grain depots and roadside stations to facilitate troop movements. They also set up checkposts, intended to filter the comings and goings of merchants, collect taxes, or welcome diplomatic missions coming from the west. The wall then becomes a genuine tool of governance with multiple functions, namely military, fiscal, and diplomatic. The extension of the Han Wall in these western regions is better understood when mentioning the epic journey of Zheng Qian, an imperial envoy who played a decisive role in opening the famous Silk Road. Sent for the first time around 139 before Christ by Emperor Han Wudi, personally known as Liu Qi, Zheng Qian receives the initial mission to contact peoples who might ally against the Xiongnu, a confederation of warrior nomads settled to the north and northwest of China. This exploration journey begins under the worst auspices, as Zheng Qian is captured early by the Xiongnu and kept in captivity for years. Nevertheless, he manages to escape and continue his journey to the territories of Central Asia, before returning to the Han court and delivering a detailed report on the regions he has visited. His stories excite the curiosity of Emperor Han Wudi, who sees in them an opportunity to establish long-distance commercial and diplomatic contacts. These insights lay the foundation for a vast network of exchanges that would later be called the Silk Road, named after the precious merchandise that China was exporting in increasing quantities. However, consolidating this route requires securing the travel routes and protecting the caravans against bandits or attacks from hostile tribes. In this context, the Han Wall becomes both a barrier and a support, as customs posts, backed by its sections, allow the collection of taxes on goods and the control of traveler flows. The Hexi corridor, already mentioned, serves as a large strategic corridor where both silk, jade, or spice merchants and political envoys interact. At the same time, the Han establishes a system of secondary fortifications, often connected by internal roads. These fortified checkpoints, sometimes guarded by several hundred soldiers, serve as waypoints for the caravans. Military officials inspect the cargoes, record travelers, and ensure that trade agreements made with external territories are respected. In some places, signal towers are even constructed. If a major threat looms, the garrison can light fires or produce smoke signals to warn neighboring posts. These measures, which combine control and protection, encourage the economic growth of the dynasty. For the first time in Chinese history, the wall thus serves as a true vector of commercial development, anchored in a transcontinental context. Alongside these commercial and diplomatic advances, the Han Empire faces a constant military threat, notably from the Xiongnu, a grouping of nomadic peoples skilled in horseback riding, proficient in the art of war, and adept at swift raids. Since the Qin Dynasty, the Chinese court has always perceived them as a major threat to its northern borders. At the dawn of the Han Dynasty, this Xiongnu pressure persists and prompts the empire to diversify its strategy. On a military level, the wall is a valuable ally as it slows incursions. But it is not enough. The Xiongnu, with exceptional mobility, sometimes execute flanking maneuvers or surprise attacks. In order to ease tensions, the Han court occasionally signs treaties known as Heqin, which can be translated as peace and kinship. These agreements generally contain two provisions. On one hand, the court commits to paying a tribute in the form of silk, grain, or other wealth. On the other hand, it sometimes agrees to marry Han princesses to Xiongnu leaders or members of their circle. This matrimonial diplomacy aims to create kinship ties between the emperor and the nomadic chiefs in hopes of curbing their warlike intentions. In return, the Xiongnu promise not to invade Han territory. Often, these Heqin treaties translate into significant quantities of silk delivered each year, which is costly for the court, but offers a period of military reprieve. However, a warlike faction at the court, encouraged by Emperor Han Wudi, considers these compromises to be disadvantageous. In their view, it's better to weaken the Xiongnu through offensive campaigns rather than buying their protection. This is how two particularly famous generals come into play, Huo Kubing and Wei Qing. Huo Kubing, the very young nephew of Wei Qing, quickly distinguishes himself with his tactical acumen, winning a series of spectacular victories. It is said that he manages to lead light troops deep into Xiongnu territory, bypassing enemy defenses, surprising their camps before retreating victorious. His prestige is such that Emperor Han Wudi showers him with honorary titles while having his achievements engraved on commemorative steles. Wei Qing, for his part, is just as essential to the success of Han expeditions. As the brother-in-law of the emperor through Empress Wei Zifu, he orchestrates several decisive campaigns that push the Xiongnu beyond the border regions, thus relieving the pressure on the wall. His operations, carefully planned, benefit from better organized logistics with supply carts, a sufficient number of horses, and prepared encampments in advance. Under his command, the Han armies destroy Xiongnu bases and advance westward, consolidating notably the region around the Hexi corridor. Thanks to these successes, the Han dynasty can envision a firmer control of this strategic route, where the wall extends, continuously or partially. Over time, The balance between diplomacy and military operations evolves according to the fortune of the Xiongnu. When they are united, the Han court often prefers the He-Qin formula, even if it means spending large amounts of silk or giving away imperial princesses. But if the Xiongnu are weakened by defeats or internal quarrels, the emperor orders new campaigns to reinforce the wall or to install outposts. This alternation never completely ends the conflicts, but it allows the Han to extend their influence beyond the walled line, while maintaining a relative sense of security among the peasant populations settled in the north. If the Han Wall imposes itself as a major element of imperial policy, it is interesting to place it in a global context. At the opposite end of Eurasia, the Roman Empire, born from the transformation of the Republic under Augustus in 27 before Christ, is expanding in the Mediterranean. Successive conquests lead it to protect its borders with various fortified devices, collectively termed as limes. Although the concept of Roman limes differs from that of a continuous wall, the idea of demarcating the empire's frontier with more or less elaborate fortifications is similar in principle. Emperor Hadrian in 117 Anno Domini will build Hadrian's Wall north of the Roman province of Britannia in present-day England to contain the tribes from Caledonia in present-day Scotland. One can thus see a strong parallel between the Han and Roman empires, each seeking to stabilize its territorial perimeter, protect its internal passages, and control commercial flows. Closer to the Chinese world, it is the Parthian Empire, established over Mesopotamia, an area roughly corresponding to Iraq and eastern Syria, that plays the role of a buffer state between Rome and China. The Parthians, successors of the Seleucids over a large part of the former Persian territory, are also engaged in border rivalries with their neighbors, notably Rome. This geopolitical situation creates a corridor of indirect exchanges between the Han Dynasty and the Roman Empire. Each trades with the other without direct contact via Parthian, Sogdian, or Bactrian intermediaries. Chinese silk, highly prized among the Roman elites, transits through this route and adorns the opulent homes of the Italian aristocracy. Conversely, products from the Mediterranean basin, such as blown glass, also reach the Han Empire after multiple resales and border crossings. This long-distance trade does not imply that the Chinese and the Romans regularly meet in person, as it requires crossing vast and often hostile territories. However, both Chinese and Roman sources hint at a mutual knowledge, albeit imperfect, but quite real. The Romans speak of Serica, or the land of silk, without knowing its exact location, while the Chinese hear about Dakin, a Chinese name sometimes attributed to the Roman Empire, and have an occasionally idealized image of it. In this context, the wall plays a more symbolic role than against nomadic threats when it comes to merchants coming from so far away. It embodies the power and logistical organization of the Han Empire, capable of welcoming or denying access to its borders as it pleases. Despite the distance, a few accounts report the arrival of Roman embassies at the Han court. Modern historians debate their authenticity, as it is possible that they were instead merchants pretending to represent Rome or emissaries sent by Central Asian kingdoms under Roman influence. Regardless, the central idea is that the Han civilization, supported by its reinforced wall and its intent to control the Hexi corridor axis, found itself embedded in a vast network of commercial and political routes. This interconnection led, for the first time in history, to the sketch of a partially connected Eurasian world where raw materials, ideas, and inventions traveled over colossal distances. Under the Han, the wall was no longer just a defensive rampart. but a pivot connecting the Chinese space to the outside world. It served as a customs post, an observation post, an imperial symbol, and a line of separation from peoples who were feared but known to be essential for the empire's expansion. The consequences of this Han policy would be felt for several centuries with the rise of the Silk Road on the western flank, the strengthening of a network of fortified citadels along the northern fringes, and more broadly, the recognition of an imperial identity that crystallized in part around the idea of a monumental frontier. As the 2nd century Anno Domini ends and the Han Empire enters a phase of internal crises, the wall remains, despite political turmoil, an indispensable structure whose presence influences regional and continental history. Nomadic tribes continue to test it, circumvent it, or negotiate with the central power, while caravanners cross it or venture into its corridors to reach other markets further west. The story of this Han wall thus overlaps with that of an expanding empire that looks beyond its own borders and integrates into a game of alliances and rivalries on the scale of the Old World. At the beginning of the 3rd century, Anno Domini, the China unified under the Han gradually collapses. Internal troubles, combined with the weakening of the central administration, paved the way for multiple warlords. This fragmented momentum results in the establishment of 3 major rival states, known as Wei, Shu, and Wu, generally referred to as the 3 kingdoms. These entities, more or less structured, vie for the succession of imperial authority and attempt to consolidate their own government. The international audience, without prior knowledge of these dynasties, should know that at this time, power fragmented into regional blocks, each trying to legitimize its sovereignty by relying on the Han dynasty's heritage. The territories controlled by Wei, Shu, and Wu vary in size and resources. The Kingdom of Wei, located in the north, occupies the densely populated regions near the former capital. The Kingdom of Shu, situated in the Sichuan Basin in the southwest, benefits from its mountainous terrain to forge a solid, defensive base. As for Wu, in the southeast, it relies on the vast riverine network of the Yangtze River. In the ongoing rivalry, these kingdoms focus their military efforts on common borders, allying or warring with each other to gain influence. However, maintaining the ancient walls erected by the Han and their predecessors is no longer a priority. Progressively, the previous fortifications, erected for defensive purposes to protect the Han Empire, deteriorate. Many earthen walls, once raised to repel incursions by steppe peoples, are left in abandonment. The warring states have neither the time nor the manpower to maintain long ramparts in areas sometimes far removed from their power centers. Furthermore, some local officers, overwhelmed by political struggles, do not accord strategic importance to remote sections of the wall, preferring to reinforce fortified cities and citadels close to their capital. The gradual weakening of the border protection encourages some nomadic bands to infiltrate deeper into Chinese territory. In the north, coalitions of warriors from diverse confederations, sometimes Xianbei, sometimes other groups, take advantage of the retreat of the garrisons. The incursions aim notably to plunder the rich agricultural lands of the south, taking away livestock and harvests. For the Western public, it is useful to understand that, as in other parts of the world where an empire collapses, think of the fall of Rome and the arrival of the Germanic peoples. The crumbling of central power in China inevitably attracts raids and migrations of border groups in search of better prospects. During this so-called Three Kingdoms period between 220 and 280 Anno Domini, the wall, inherited from past dynasties, is no longer a coherent national defense tool. It fragments like the entire country. The warring episodes, sometimes unstable diplomacy, and lack of material means leave whole sections in ruins. This negligence will have consequences on the stability of the kingdoms, because once the marauders cross the old lines of defense without much resistance, they can directly threaten agricultural regions and push the local aristocracy to find other ways to protect themselves. The internal and external tensions will continue until the advent of new, more centralized dynasties, ready to restore, or at least rethink, the defensive organization that once constituted a vital bulwark for sedentary populations. After several decades of prolonged fragmentation, it is the Sui dynasty in 581 that manages to restore for a time the unity of China. The founder of this dynasty, Emperor Wen, going by the reign name Sui Wendi, comes from a noble family from northern China. He takes advantage of the weakness of rival kingdoms to progressively consolidate his authority. Like other ambitious leaders, he becomes aware that the defense of the borders and the preservation of internal order depend on the rehabilitation of major infrastructures, notably the wall. Upon ascending to power, the Sui sovereigns undertake colossal works to stabilize the country and increase imperial control, particularly in the northern region, often exposed to nomadic raids. The Sui order the reconstruction of abandoned sections, combining new materials and sturdier construction methods. While rammed earth remains used, some sections begin to be reinforced with stones and rudimentary bricks, at least for the foundations and strategically judged points. Although the requisitioned labor force is large and composed of peasants and soldiers, the central government also mobilizes substantial fiscal resources to finance these projects. In addition to the wall, the Sui dynasty implements other structural reforms aimed at unifying the administration with a standardized bureaucratic system, better controlled taxation, and public works like the Grand Canal. This canal, linking the northern plain of the Yellow River to the southern region of the Yangtze, facilitates the transport of grains and military deployment. For the emperor, the objective is clear and consists of linking all the vital areas of the country and ensuring a rapid response to threats. In this will of centralization, the wall regains its status as a symbolic and practical defensive line. However, the Sui dynasty remains short-lived, largely due to costly military campaigns and domestic policies deemed too burdensome for the population. The gargantuan expenses linked to wars against neighboring kingdoms and the constant mobilization for large-scale projects fuel deep discontent. Peasant revolts multiply, weakening the government. Towards the end of the Sui reign, China is once again on the brink of widespread insurrection. Emperor Yang, whose real name is Sui Yangdi, known for his luxury and disastrous campaigns against the Korean kingdom of Goguryeo, sees his authority rapidly erode. Despite the short duration of the Sui dynasty, its legacy in the restoration of the Great Wall is significant. The foundations laid during this period, notably with partially improved construction methods, rehabilitated watchtowers, and organized garrisons, would serve as a starting point for the succeeding dynasty, the Tang. Thus, the brief Sui experience shows that a state eager to assert itself must not only undertake grand projects, but also manage the social and economic costs of these endeavors. The stony foundations initiated at this time testify to an awareness as a mere earthen wall is no longer sufficient in the face of technological advancements and external pressures. The Tang dynasty in 618, considered by many as a golden age of Chinese civilization, immediately succeeds the period of Sui instability. Emperor Gaozu, whose real name is Li Yuan, founder of the Tang, seizes power on the ruins of the weakened Sui administration. Very quickly, it is his son Li Shimin who becomes Emperor Taizong, who shapes the political and military power of this new era. The Tang inherit the reforms initiated by the Sui and rely on the newfound unity to develop a prosperous empire, open to trade with Central Asia and other regions of the world. Unlike other dynasties that saw the Great Wall as an indispensable rampart, the Tang adopted a different approach to defense. First, they relied on a highly effective mobile cavalry, capable of swiftly moving across the northern steppes to counter potential invasions. This tactic, combined with a policy of matrimonial alliances with certain nomadic tribes, reduced the urgency to maintain a continuous fortified line. Diplomatic agreements, Qin, and marriages between Tang princes and princesses of nomadic confederations ensure relative peace on the northern borders, making large-scale construction of new walls superfluous. Nevertheless, the Tang dynasty does not completely abandon the defensive legacy. Some sections, especially those near main access routes, are maintained. Postal relays and watchtowers are modernized, particularly along strategic corridors like the Hexi, which links China to the Tarim Basin and beyond to Central Asia. These relay stations, combined with smoke signals, enable efficient military communication. But the heart of Tang power relies more on its ability to mobilize seasoned troops and negotiate on the political stage rather than the need to maintain an interminable Great Wall of bricks or earth. Internally, Tang centralization results in a highly structured bureaucracy and an imperial recruitment system via imperial examinations called Keiju. This organization efficiently administers a widely extending empire while fostering cultural development. The city of Chang'an, today's Xi'an, the capital at the time, becomes a cosmopolitan hub where merchants, scholars, and diplomats from Asia and the Near East converge. In this flourishing context, the massive construction of fixed fortifications becomes secondary. Art, poetry, commerce, and international diplomacy take the forefront of the political scene. However, towards the end of the Tang dynasty, rebellious movements and external pressures reappear. Internal civil wars, the emergence of regional military leaders, and the rise of nomadic tribes in the steppes create new fractures. Far from the early days of glory, the dynasty gradually weakens after the mid-9th century. The defensive infrastructures, whether it is the Great Wall or the frontier garrisons, suffer from underinvestment and struggle to stem the centrifugal forces. But despite these weaknesses, the Tang dynasty marked Chinese history with its openness, cultural flourishing, and skillful handling of military issues, in which the Great Wall becomes a secondary element, no longer the backbone of national security. Between the 7th and 10th centuries, while China navigates through the Sui and Tang dynasties, other civilizations across the world also undergo major transformations. On the Arabian Peninsula, the advent of Islam under the leadership of the Prophet Muhammad in the early 7th century disrupts the regional geopolitical balance. Quickly, the caliphs, successive Muslim leaders, extend their authority over vast territories, from Syria to Egypt, then to Persia. The Umayyads, in 661, based in Damascus, continue this expansion, even crossing the Strait of Gibraltar to venture into the Iberian Peninsula. Then, the Abbasid dynasty in 750 moves the capital to Baghdad and consolidates a thriving empire, pioneering in mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy. At the same time, the Byzantine Empire, heir to Eastern Rome, faces multiple threats. After long resisting the Persian Sassanid invasions, Byzantium finds itself confronted with Arab conquests. Constantinople, a powerful and wealthy Byzantine capital, boasts its own impressive walls, particularly the famous walls of Theodosius, allowing the city to repel several sieges. Thus, At a time when the Great Wall of China faces relative neglect, the Byzantines display their own tradition of imposing fortifications, reflecting the diversity of defensive solutions adopted according to cultural and geographical contexts. In the Americas, the pre-Columbian civilizations continue their evolution. In the Yucatan region, the classic Maya civilization, in full bloom from the 3rd to the 9th century, builds city-states equipped with pyramids, palaces, and ceremonial plazas. Although these settlements sometimes engage in warfare, the idea of a common wall is absent. The Mayas did not develop this kind of continuous border structure, preferring to build occasional urban enclosures. Their major achievements are more architectural and astronomical, as seen in Tikal, Palenque, or Copan. On the other side of the Atlantic, in West Africa, the Empire of Ghana, not to be confused with the modern state of the same name, slowly takes shape. Located on crucial trade routes for gold and salt, it serves as an economic hub between the Sahara and the more humid regions of the Gulf of Guinea. This empire also does not adopt the idea of a long, permanent defensive wall, relying instead on control of trade routes and local garrisons to protect its interests. Thus, from the 7th to the 10th century, the defense of territories and the notion of borders manifest in various ways depending on the civilizations. While the Umayyads and Abbasids succeed in building an empire through religious zeal and conquest, Byzantium relies on a sophisticated system of urban fortifications. The Mayas, meanwhile, develop independent city-states prospering through engineering and a complex culture, rather than a great unifying wall. The Empire of Ghana favors economic growth by controlling trade flows, avoiding the need to invest in a continuous barrier. In East Asia, the Tang dynasty, strong with its cavalry and alliances with certain tribes, distinguishes itself from the principle of uninterrupted wall construction. It prioritizes the maintenance of communication routes and military flexibility. This view, more distant from the Great Wall, a major symbol for earlier times, Qin and Han, as well as future called Ming, proves that each dynasty makes its defensive choices based on the geopolitical context and its priorities. If we compare the Great Wall of China during its period of relative neglect under the Tang to the solid walls of Constantinople, we clearly see two models of spatial and military organization. For a Chinese dynasty in full commercial and cultural expansion, it is more effective to forge regional alliances and project rapid force than to mobilize thousands of peasants to erect or restore remote sections of the wall. In contrast, Byzantium, besieged by more direct assaults in a geographically confined space, invests massively in unbreachable urban enclosures. As for the Arab caliphates, their initial thirst for conquest resembles a rapid military expansion, requiring less a fortified barrier than a system of outposts and governors called emirs. Overall, the 7th to 10th centuries thus emerge as a transitional period for East Asia, the Near East, Africa, and the Americas. Each region adapts its relationship to space, defense, and political organization. China, under the Sui, and then the Tang, undertakes new forms of internal consolidation and diplomatic expansion, while partially preserving the wall as a reference line. The global upheavals of this era, whether it be the emergence of Islam or the Byzantine solidity, remind us that the world stage is marked by increasing exchanges and multifaceted rivalries. By the end of the Tang period, despite the culturally renowned prosperity, China gradually finds itself divided into multiple principalities and military governorates. New invaders from the north, as well as internal rebellions, weaken the central government. The remaining sections of the wall still in service cannot indefinitely contain these upheavals. The cycles of neglect and restoration thus characterize this long era, from the fall of the Han to the end of the Tang. The wall is sometimes restored by a regime concerned with security, sometimes neglected as offensive and diplomatic strategies take precedence over purely defensive approaches. This overview of the period 220–907, encompassing the fragmentation of the Three Kingdoms, the brief Sui centralization, and the Tang apex, highlights the constant evolution of priorities in China. It also illustrates how, far from being a unique and immutable entity, the wall experiences varying fortunes depending on the political, economic, and military context. The following centuries will continue this alternation with border wars, innovations, imperial peaks and retreats, always linked to the recurring question: how to protect a vast territory open to infinite steppes while maintaining vital diplomatic and commercial exchanges. In this complex game, the wall is not merely a defensive work, but a mirror of power dynamics and the image a state wants to project, both to its neighbors and its own subjects. During the period in question, China is not the only one experimenting with this dialectic between openness and protection. Universal history continuously combines the establishment of physical or political boundaries with the pursuit of contacts, alliances, and trade routes, as evidenced by the Byzantine, Islamic, Maya, and West African worlds. However, from 907 onwards, the final rupture of the Tang dynasty ushers China into a new phase of divisions, marking the transition to the 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms. The decline of central power reopens the debate on the maintenance of fortifications. Populations again endure political uncertainties, and some regional lords erect their own enclosures. The future rise of the Song dynasty, starting in 960, will reveal still other priorities, notably the implementation of more sophisticated armaments thanks to the nascent gunpowder. At the turn of the year 960, the northern Song dynasty asserted itself as the heir to a fragmented empire rich with a history that was already millennia old. Founded by Zhao Kuangyin, known as Emperor Taizu, the Song dynasty in 960 endeavored to unify the majority of the Chinese territory after the civil wars following the fall of the Tang in 907. In its early years, however, the Song government constantly faced the challenge of maintaining the security of its northern borders against increasingly fierce and organized regional powers. In this context, the famous wall, or rather what remained of it at the time, took on strategic importance. Contrary to the unified conceptions that would be discussed in subsequent centuries, the wall under the Song in reality presented itself as a series of discontinuous sections and ancient ramparts erected by previous dynasties. The structures of rammed earth and stones, erected or consolidated over time, appeared here and there on the northern and northwestern borders of the empire, but they did not constitute a coherent and continuous barrier. Many of these fortifications suffered from natural erosion, lack of maintenance, or were simply captured and repurposed by rivals. In this China from the 11th to 13th century, the wall was thus less a unified symbol than a memory of ancient glories, whose strategic usefulness depended closely on the will or resources of each local state. The Song, concerned with their defense, sought military solutions more adapted to their time, even if it meant partially neglecting what already seemed to belong to a legacy of the past. The northern Song dynasty, indeed, found itself confronted with a delicate military predicament. The Song armies no longer excelled as much in heavy cavalry or in deploying the large terrestrial formations that past dynasties could wield. They suffered a series of military setbacks against their northern neighbors, which forced them to reassess their defense priorities. The imperial court, from the end of the 10th century, decided to invest more massively than ever in the development of artillery based on gunpowder, an invention attested in China since the Tang Dynasty, but still rudimentary in its beginnings. The song improved the composition of the powder, developed incendiary projectiles, and refined bomb launchers, sometimes called fire lances. Simultaneously, they paid great attention to the establishment of advanced defense towers. These towers, erected along strategic points and often near the still usable sections of the wall, allowed for increased surveillance of enemy movements and housed rudimentary artillery pieces. Song engineers strived to adapt the architecture of these towers to often complex topographies, notably on mountain passes, in desert regions, or near fertile valleys. For the Song command, the idea was no longer to rely exclusively on old linear fortifications, but rather to multiply autonomous fortified points, capable of communicating with each other through visual or auditory signals. This system proved more flexible, but also required significant logistical means, making the maintenance of an already damaged and partially obsolete continuous wall even less of a priority. To the north and northeast of the Song Empire, two great powers emerge, one controlled by the Khitan and the other by the Tanguts, which will reshape the regional geopolitics. The Khitan, founders of the Liao dynasty in 907, have gradually expanded from the Mongolian steppes and dominate a large part of what corresponds today to northeast China. The Tanguts, meanwhile, organized themselves in the region known as Xixia in 1038, and control areas ranging from the Ordos Plateau to the northwestern confines. Each of these peoples, once largely composed of nomads, builds its own fortification systems, or, in many cases, appropriate segments of the ancient wall built under the Wei, the Sui, or the Tang. The Khitan, eager to secure their newly conquered territories, take control of fortified sections, which they adapt by adding specific defensive elements, such as reinforced parapets, construction of posterns to facilitate troop movement, and installation of fixed garrisons. The Tanguts of Xixia early on follow the example of the Liao, and also use these pre-existing wall portions to consolidate their southern border, forming for them a line of defense against the Song. This appropriation of the wall by rival states shows clearly that at this time, the notion of a defensive barrier is no longer confined to a single empire, and these walls can change hands, be expanded or transformed according to the geopolitical balance of the moment. The Song, hampered by repeated defeats, sometimes have to acknowledge the definitive loss of certain regions where the wall now becomes an instrument of control for their enemies. As the balance of power evolves, the Song territories gradually shrink in favor of these border dynasties, particularly in the 12th century when the Jurchen replaced the Khitan and established the Qin dynasty in 1115. However, even before the shift in hegemony to the Qin, the Liao dynasty allows its populations to settle in the contact areas with the Song, maintaining a state of almost permanent tension. It is thus not surprising to note that many forts, watchtowers, and sections of the wall once attached to the Song Empire are now under Khitan or Tangut, and later Jurchen, banners to protect or monitor conquered territories. These walls, anchored in valleys traversed by valuable trade routes, also serve as an economic barrier, meaning controlling a segment of the wall involves collecting transit duties and better taxing goods coming from the south. In this mosaic of powers, the wall is far from being a mere backdrop, as it has strategic, fiscal, and symbolic value, visibly embodying control over the land. The local populations, acknowledging these changes, must adapt to the presence of garrisons speaking other languages or enforcing foreign laws. Meanwhile, the Song court strives, as best as it can, to maintain the illusion of uninterrupted sovereignty over its borders, but the reality is much more complex. Sometimes, in official texts, the loss of wall sections is minimized, as if these structures were no longer central to the imperial strategy. Technologically, the song mark a major turning point in gunpowder-based armament, often arousing wonder or curiosity among surrounding peoples. They indeed perfect the formula for explosive powder made of saltpeter, charcoal, and sulfur, and design various siege or battlefield engines adapted to these new weapons. As such, bamboo arrows equipped with explosive charges called fire arrows are used to disorient or scare enemy cavalry. Primitive fragmentation bombs, consisting of metal or ceramic casings filled with powder and projectiles, appear on some battlefields. Next to these pyrotechnic innovations, the song further developed their ballistae and repeating crossbows, inheritors of a long tradition of Chinese military engineering, but enriched with new mechanical concepts. The regular deployment of pyrotechnic signals, often combined with watchtowers, complements this defensive system. From simple smoke visible from afar, protections evolved into actual crackling rockets, more complex to manufacture, but capable of transmitting alerts in a spectacular and rapid manner. However, song engineers maintained the caution of their era, and the production of gunpowder weapons often remained centralized to prevent the technology from spreading too widely among rebellious populations or in areas likely to fall into enemy hands. Despite these military advances, the song failed to completely contain the coordinated offensives of the Liao, and later the Jin, demonstrating a context where technology, advanced as it may be, cannot compensate for certain structural weaknesses or the lack of solid political alliances. During the same period, the European world was undergoing its own upheavals. The Crusades, initiated by Pope Urban II's call in 1095, marked the rise of religious wars led by Catholic powers to reclaim or defend territories in the Middle East, considered the Holy Land. Knights from France, England, or the Holy Roman Empire embarked on armed pilgrimages, first aiming for Jerusalem, conquered in 1099, and then other strategic cities in the eastern Mediterranean. In this context, Latin Europe rediscovered the importance of fortifications, notably to protect its strongholds in the Holy Land or fortify its ports in the Mediterranean basin. Norman castles, the fortresses of the Hospitallers, or the Templars, served as Western equivalents of defense lines, though their scope was more sporadic than truly linear. Simultaneously, the rise of Italian merchant cities like Venice, Genoa, or Pisa observed wealth growth through maritime trade and participated in the logistics of crusader armies by transporting troops and provisions. These city-states also developed distant contacts with the East, sometimes establishing trade outposts in the Black Sea or on the Levantine coasts. Gradually, the desire to discover new routes and establish connections with Asian lands fueled the imagination and curiosity of European elites, who heard of faraway territories sometimes described as vast and mysterious. The reputation of China as a land of silk, porcelain, and remarkable inventions spread in travelers' and merchants' accounts, long before the publication of more famous narratives in the 13th and 14th centuries. While the song worked on perfecting their gunpowder weapons, and Europe remained mired in or restructured through the Crusades, maritime and overland exchanges developed between the Levant, Central Asia, and the Chinese Imperial Institute. It is possible that echoes of Chinese gunpowder technology reached blacksmiths or alchemists in the Islamic world, and from there, later Europe. However, the exact timeline of these knowledge transfers remains debated, and some historians believe that simplified versions of rockets or firecrackers circulated via merchant caravans, while others believe in a more direct transfer later on, particularly during the Mongol invasions in the 13th century. Thus, during the Song era, European attention was not frankly focused on the Chinese wall, whose fragmented form was largely unknown. People talked more about the empire's wealth and its brilliant culture than any immense rampart. The great cultural and religious movements shaking the West, such as the Christian mission sent to the Middle East, did not immediately lead to an influx of travelers to East Asia. Nevertheless, the ground for curiosity was sown, and some European scholars or adventurers, intrigued by stories from the Levant, mentally prepared for future great explorations. At the end of the 12th and the beginning of the 13th century, a flourishing economy takes root in certain parts of medieval Europe, notably in the regions of Flanders or northern Italy. Italian merchants, in particular, take advantage of the commercial dynamics to venture ever further towards the east in search of silks, spices, and other exotic products. The Song, for their part, intensify their maritime trade in the China Sea and the Indian Ocean, but struggle to secure their continental borders. The Liao are supplanted by the Jin, who, after overthrowing their former allies, dominate a vast area in the north, including the North China Plain and even the territory of present-day Beijing. The Song, entrenched further south, however, maintain their economic and cultural prosperity, supported notably by the expansion of inland river commerce and innovations in rice agriculture. In this context, the wall, preserved in earth or bricks, remains for the most part fragmented and contested. Neither the Song nor the Jin seek to reform a single wall in the manner of earlier periods, preferring to channel their efforts into constructing specific fortresses and localized defensive lines. This reality may surprise a contemporary audience, accustomed to the idea of a continuous Great Wall. During the Song era, this unified concept no longer exists, submerged by a conjuncture of regional rivalries where each power is only interested in segments offering an immediate tactical or economic advantage. It is in this climate of turbulence and upheaval that one of the most famous European travelers in history emerges, Marco Polo. Born around 1254 in Venice, into a family of merchants, Marco Polo accompanies his father Niccolo and his uncle Maffeo on a journey that will take him to Asia, the exact chronology of which spans approximately from 1271 to 1295. According to his account, later compiled in Le Dévisement du Monde, often called the Book of Marvels, he traverses the lands of Central Asia until reaching the heart of the Mongol Empire, then ruled by Kublai Khan, founder of the Yuan dynasty. The question remains, however, did he really see or cross sections of the wall now controlled by the Mongols or by what remained of the Jin? Many historians have questioned the absence of a detailed description of this wall in Marco Polo's account. Some suggest that he may have crossed fortified sections whose existence would be familiar to him, but did not give them the same importance as other marvels, such as the sumptuous cities or imperial palaces. Others believe he deliberately omitted to mention it to highlight more spectacular aspects of his Asian encounters. Some specialists even doubt the veracity of some of his travels, suspecting that he compiled testimonies of other merchants without visiting all the localities described himself. Yet, most acknowledge that Marco Polo did indeed explore a large part of Asia under Mongol rule. The controversy does not detract from the fact that his account deeply marked the European imagination, offering one of the first coherent descriptions, or at least perceived as such at the time, of China and its technological and cultural wonders. The snippets of information he provides on fortresses, Mongol military power, and territorial organization captivate a West eager for exotic tales. At the beginning of the 13th century, a succession of nomadic clan leaders begins to transform the vast steppes of Central Asia into an empire that will upset the geopolitics of the region and, by extension, the world. This process crystallizes around the figure of Genghis Khan, born around 1162. His true name is said to have been Temujin, and he is born into an environment where rivalry between nomadic tribes determines survival. Through his charisma, cleverly concluded alliances, and formidable military force, he manages to unite the main confederations of Mongols and neighboring peoples. In 1206, he receives the title of Genghis Khan, often translated as universal ruler, symbolizing the consolidation of his power over the steppes. The rapid Mongol expansion quickly came up against sedentary kingdoms, notably in the territories that correspond to present-day northern China. For centuries, various Chinese regimes had built scattered walls and fortifications to counter incursions from the north. However, Genghis Khan's Mongols soon realized that simple walls of earth or stone, even if connected in some sections, could not stop a highly mobile army with elite cavalry. The Mongols' major asset lay in their mounted archers, capable of shooting arrows from long distances while moving swiftly. Other tactical innovations supported this light cavalry, including precise identification of infiltration routes, exploiting enemy defenses to their advantage, and especially methodically bypassing fortified points deemed too lengthy to besiege. As they advanced southward, the Mongols identified natural passes and weak points in enemy lines. Genghis Khan's successive victories against the Qin Dynasty, which then ruled over northern China, illustrated his skill in bypassing fortified positions rather than breaking them head-on. Faced with walls already partially degraded or poorly defended in some sections, the Mongol army advanced by relying on its steppe logistics, namely rapid movements, the ability to carry minimal food reserves, sometimes in the form of dried meat or fermented milk, and the ability to improvise temporary camps. As these invasions increased, the initially defensive nature of many wall sections became obsolete, as the enemy did not appear where expected. After Genghis Khan's death in 1227, the empire was divided among his sons and later his grandsons, but the idea of continuous expansion remained. One of his most famous descendants is Kublai Khan, born around 1215, who founded the Yuan dynasty in 1271 after defeating the Song dynasty in the south. During this period, the Mongols perfected their siege strategy by also employing heavy cavalry to break the resistance of strongholds. At the same time, they enhanced their mastery of cartography and intelligence, using local informants to identify key points and weaknesses in walls that still protected some cities. Under Kublai Khan, China gradually became the administrative heart of this multinational empire. Beijing, then called Khanbalik or Dadu, became the capital. In this context, some ancient border fortifications fell into disuse. Since they no longer constituted a barrier between a north dominated by nomadic tribes and an imperial south, the Mongols preferred to exploit or even dismantle these structures to adapt them to their own needs. This period saw the wall, once designed to protect the Chinese world from barbarians, turned around as its original designers were militarily surpassed by Genghis Khan's descendants. By seizing power in Chinese territories, the Mongols had to manage a vast geographical expanse, including both Mongolian steppe regions and more densely populated southern areas where agriculture, crafts, and commerce prospered. To effectively govern this space, they needed roads and stronger control points than the old walls that fragmented the landscape. The Mongols then undertook to reorient the use of certain wall sections. Rather than systematically maintaining existing structures, they preferred to demolish, repurpose materials, and clear more direct routes for their troops and convoys. Mongol engineers, aided by Chinese experts recruited willingly or by force, conducted detailed examinations of defensive sections. They chose to dismantle certain segments of rammed earth, particularly those that no longer held military interest or could obstruct the movement of armies into strategic areas. Entire sections of walls, once built to repel nomadic raids, were leveled or partially destroyed to transform a defensive setup into a communication route. This repurposing matched the Mongol regime's priority on mobility and ease of movement. Moreover, the Mongolian administration establishes a new surveillance system, less tied to the traditional idea of fixed posts on a long, continuous wall. During the Yuan dynasty, garrisons and control officers are installed within the territory itself, along routes where goods, military convoys, and diplomatic envoys travel. Old fortresses, once built on hill crests or mountain passes to serve as alert points facing north, are gradually integrated into a denser network of administrative offices, mail relays, and taxation points. This logistical redistribution, paradoxically, allows the Mongols to better govern an empire that far exceeds the traditional borders of China. Regions beyond the Great Wall, such as Inner Mongolia, the Kazakh steppe, or even Manchuria, are no longer perceived as hostile and unexplored zones, but as an integral part of a coherent imperial space. The very concept of a border is thus blurred, and the Mongols do not see the wall as a means to stop anyone, but rather as a potential obstacle to the fluidity of their military campaigns. At the same time, to consolidate their power, they maintain garrisons at key points like high mountain passes and narrow defiles that enable quick passage from one province to another. Turks, Uyghurs, and other peoples, previously nomadic or distant subjects, can be recruited as auxiliaries. They sometimes guard these strategic passages, demonstrating that in the Yuan period, territorial surveillance is conceived more in depth than along a single front line. Before the arrival of the Mongols, one of the military communication systems in northern China was based on smoke signals. When scouts spotted the enemy, they lit a fire on a watchtower. The smoke, visible from afar, was relayed from tower to tower, warning garrisons of an imminent threat. This technique, practiced since the ancient warring states, remained suitable for an environment where threats often came from the outside, particularly from the northern steppes. However, with the establishment of the Yuan dynasty, the situation changes. The Mongol Empire now occupies the steppe and controls most of Asia, so much so that smoke alerts at the borders lose their essential traditional function. Instead, the Mongols implement a highly developed postal system called YAM. This term refers to the network of relays and stations responsible for welcoming messengers, supplying mounts, and distributing mail throughout the empire. Thanks to the YAM, orders, reports, and news travel at an unprecedented speed for the time. Fresh horses and hosts able to accommodate imperial personnel are positioned at regular intervals, often every 40 or 50 kilometers. The word YAM can also refer to the document that authorizes its bearer to use these relays. This administrative innovation responds to the logic of a multinational empire, which extends from present-day Hungary and Russia to the fringes of China. Within the YAM, each administrative agent, ambassador, and official messenger has enough resources to travel quickly, communicate the orders of the court of Kublai Khan, and convey the responses of local officials. The system is initially inspired by nomadic practices, where information had to circulate quickly to coordinate scattered groups over large distances. In reality, this communication structure far exceeds what existed until then in Imperial China. If the wall once served as a line of alert and relay point for cavalry, it becomes secondary to a postal system spread across the entire Eurasian continent. Nonetheless, the Mongols did not neglect the idea of local defense. Garrisons were stationed all over, including near old walled sections. But attention shifted to offering routes and relays because the main threat was no longer the steppe cavalry, but the difficulty of controlling a vast cosmopolitan empire where Mongol lords, Chinese elites, Central Asian princes, and foreign merchants from the West coexisted. The smoke signal network thus lost its usefulness in favor of the expansion of the yam, a symbol of globalization orchestrated by the Mongol Empire. As the Yuan dynasty established itself in China after 1271, a relatively stable period, sometimes called the Pax Mongolica, was established across the Eurasian continent. Contrary to a simplistic image of conquerors solely focused on war, the Mongols were also fervent promoters of trade and cultural exchanges. They remained aware that maintaining order in their immense empire depended on the harmonious circulation of gold, silver, goods, and ideas. The ancient walls that once protected certain regions gave way to a vast corridor for caravans and merchants. It became easier for a trader to depart from the Black Sea towards Central Asian cities, traverse the foothills of the Tian Shan, and then reach the current region of Gansu in China. Among the goods traveling these routes, silk always figures prominently, as do spices from Southeast Asia, incense from the borders of India and the Arabian regions, and Chinese porcelain, much sought after in Persia. Maritime techniques also evolved thanks to strengthened contacts between the Indian Ocean and the Chinese coast. Arab and Persian navigators attracted attention, while Venetian and Genoese merchants settled in the Levant sought to take advantage of the relatively peaceful climate imposed by Mongol power to venture further afield. The famous Venetian traveler Marco Polo in 1254, who supposedly stayed at the court of Kublai Khan, described in his accounts, which remain partly controversial, a structured imperial organization with safe roads, relay stations, abundant goods, and, generally, an attraction to Chinese culture. Whether he saw it all or not, he bears witness to a new reality. Under the Yuan dynasty, a merchant or ambassador could hope to cross the continent under much more favorable conditions than before. The Rhine, Danube, Euphrates, Sirdaria, or Huanghe, the Yellow River, then marked out an itinerary where Mongol diplomacy often protected more than it attacked. However, this opening of land and sea routes, so beneficial for the economy and transmission of knowledge, proved to be a double-edged sword. The growing flow of people and goods also facilitated the spread of epidemics. The most famous, the Black Death, would erupt in the late 1340s and spread rapidly. Its expansion is strongly linked to the intensity of exchanges under the Pax Mongolica. Caravans carried not only silk or spices, but also fleas, carrying the Yersinia pestis bacteria. From China or Central Asia, the plague made its way along the land route to Crimea, then reached Europe via Genoese and Venetian trading posts. In 1347 and 1348, the pandemic ravaged major cities in the Mediterranean basin and spread within a few years to almost the entire European continent. Demography was upheaved, while the Yuan dynasty itself weakened in China, following internal troubles and epidemics that exhausted the population. Thus, the very network that initially enabled unprecedented commercial and cultural growth ultimately precipitated the rapid spread of the disease. Nevertheless, for most of the Mongol period, this Pax Mongolica wove denser links between Europe, the Middle East, and East Asia than before. Discoveries and techniques circulated with newfound fluidity. Gunpowder, already known in China, gradually reached the West, where it would revolutionize artillery. Coin minting methods, astronomical knowledge, and various inventions such as paper also remain major contributions. The Yuan dynasty sporadically encouraged exchanges of scholars, notably bringing in craftsmen from Central Asia and Persian specialists in astronomy. In this context, the Great Wall no longer serves the same defensive function. The empire extends well beyond what was once the northern boundary of traditional China, and the military threat is more internal or related to rebellion than to external enemies capable of crossing a wall. Symbolically, the wall is reversed, in that it is no longer a barrier opposing two distinct worlds. On the contrary, it becomes a relic, carried away by a system of exchanges transcending the old boundaries. If the often brutal coexistence between Mongol conquerors and Chinese populations eventually leads to conflicts, the legacy of Kublai Khan endures until the mid-14th century. Around 1351, popular uprisings known as the Red Turban Rebellion weaken the Yuan power and contribute to the general decline of Mongol administration. Natural disasters, fiscal tensions, and the weight of the epidemic accelerate this process. In 1368, Zhu Yuanzhang, leader of one of the insurrections, captures Beijing and forces the last Mongol Khans to retreat to Inner Mongolia. He then founds the Ming Dynasty, marking the end of the Mongol era in China. The passage of time, articulated around these successive reigns, highlights the evolution of the wall according to imperial policies. For the Mongol Empire, it is not an asset or a guarantee of security, but rather a cumbersome set of structures preferred to be dismantled or adapted by sections. The postal relays called Yam, the heavy cavalry, and the rise of international trade mark the Yuan period far more than the presence of a long rampart. And while to the eyes of medieval Westerners, China remains associated with a gigantic barrier, the reality, between 1271 and 1368, is that of an empire centered on circulation and flexibility, where the wall is far from a strategic priority. The Ming Dynasty, which extends from 1368 to 1644, represents a major turning point in the history of the Great Wall of China. After the partial dismantling of the fortifications by the Mongols under the Yuan dynasty between 1271 and 1368, the new Ming rulers intend to restore Chinese sovereignty and protect the empire from northern threats. This ambition fits into a complex political and military context, characterized by the emergence of powerful nomadic tribes such as the Oirats in the west and the Jurchens further to the northeast, who will soon impose themselves under the name of Manchus. The Ming, aware that they need to consolidate their authority, choose to re-establish the imperial seat in Beijing at the heart of the former Mongol territory and to initiate a vast, fortified reconstruction program. With the aim of making the northern frontier of the empire impassable, this new enclosure, largely built of brick and granite, represents the most tangible legacy of the Ming endeavor. The goal is to control and channel the movement of people, goods, and armies through an unprecedented defensive network. For many contemporary visitors, it is the most familiar structure, the one we readily associate with the Great Wall as we know it today, with its imposing watchtowers, steep stairs, and carefully constructed walls. At the time the Ming Dynasty is established, the Mongol threat remains vivid. Although expelled from Inner China, some Mongol groups retain significant power in the steppe regions beyond the northern boundary. The Oirats, grouped in what is now Western Mongolia, aim to restore their authority where the empire founded by Genghis Khan once reigned. Meanwhile, the Jurchens, ancestors of the future Manchus, are settled further east and are watching for an opportunity to expand. The first Ming emperors, starting with Hongwu in 1368, understand that their regime's survival depends on mastering these frontiers. They rely on internal garrisons and targeted military campaigns to repel incursions from the north. As for the city of Beijing, it rapidly becomes a strategic bastion housing the court and constitutes a major barrier against potential invasions. The gradual withdrawal of the Mongols to more distant steppes does not erase the danger, as sporadic raids still target border territories, pushing the Ming to strengthen their defenses. Tensions with the Oirats and the Yurchens thus represent a determining factor in the conception and realization of the new fortifications of the Great Wall, explaining the unprecedented scale of the defensive projects undertaken under this dynasty. The consolidation of the wall under the Ming Dynasty truly begins with the reign of Emperor Hongwu, the dynasty's founder, but it is under his son, Emperor Yongle, who ascends to power in 1402, that the program takes its full measure. Intent on defending Beijing, established as the official capital, Yongle orders the construction of more robust and durable ramparts than the simple earthworks of earlier times. The masons employ bricks, hydraulic lime, granito, and sometimes even dressed stone, particularly in the areas deemed most vulnerable. The watchtowers, now square and spaced regularly between 80 and 100 meters apart, allow for continuous surveillance of the surrounding area. This deployment of defensive works involves the construction of interior staircases, battlements, loopholes for firing arrows or muskets, as well as solid parapets that can accommodate light artillery pieces. The guiding idea is to unify a set of sections inherited from previous reigns in order to form a defensive continuum, interconnected by a network of strategic roads and passes. This initiative sometimes takes the form of ex nihilo reconstructions, notably when existing fortifications prove too obsolete or too damaged, but often Ming engineers simply adapt and improve what already exists, ensuring that the entire structure meets unified technical standards at the imperial scale. To sustainably secure these new fortifications, the Ming implement an original system of military organization based on garrisons called Weisuo or Weisuo. At each critical portion of the wall, there is a garrison tasked with monitoring the condition of the walls, training recruits, and ensuring a permanent armed presence. The soldiers, mostly from rural backgrounds, are required to perform dual activities. They must not only defend the border, but also cultivate the surrounding lands to ensure their subsistence and that of their families. This system of soldier farmers allows the state to reduce the cost of troop maintenance while promoting military settlement in border regions. The imperial authorities distribute plots of land to soldiers' families, granting them partial or total tax exemptions in return. Well supervised, this model of internal colonization reinforces the viability of the fortifications by ensuring an autonomous logistical network, since the garrisons produce cereals, vegetables, and livestock, thus reducing the need to import supplies over long distances. In the event of an offensive, these soldier producers transform into seasoned defenders, able to quickly respond to alerts transmitted by the dense network of watchtowers. Viewer Dao. Beyond its strictly defensive function, the wall plays a significant economic role under the Ming. Controlling the checkpoints allows for the collection of taxes on goods in transit, whether it be salt, textiles, horses, or metals. The Ming thus elevate the wall to a genuine fiscal barrier, forcing merchants to pay specific customs duties to sell or buy in the imperial markets. Furthermore, the dynasty develops the exploitation of silver mines, whose production greatly feeds the state's coffers. The opening of new trade routes, notably maritime ones, does not prevent the prosperity of certain land routes that follow the wall or cross it at specific points. Guard posts, transformed into toll stations, bolster the financial power of the Ming. However, this economic windfall must be reinvested to maintain the garrisons, repair structures damaged by the weather, and modernize the weaponry. The empire, despite its immense size, remains vulnerable to climatic irregularities such as droughts and floods, as well as to internal crises. As a result, the arrangement of the wall, taxes, and troops' pay is a delicate balance. Any decline in mining profitability or border trade threatens the Ming's ability to finance the maintenance of this colossal edifice. In 1449, one of the most famous episodes in the military history of the Ming occurred, known as the Battle of Tumu, where Emperor Zhengtong, also known as Yingzong, was captured by the Mongolian forces led by Asen Taishi. This humiliating defeat revealed the flaws of the defensive setup and the vulnerability of the imperial court, which was installed in Beijing precisely to guard against such dangers. Following this event, the high authorities undertook to reform and strengthen the fortifications, doubling efforts to prevent such a disaster from happening again. It is at this stage that General Qi Jiguang appears in 1528, a visionary officer tasked with organizing coastal defense against Japanese pirates called Waco, before being assigned to supervise the northern borders. He studied the configurations of crenellations and applied standardized modifications, known as horse teeth, intended to improve the efficiency of defensive fire. The garrisons were then equipped with a more effective alert system, combining flags, fires, and drums so that an attack could be detected and relayed in the shortest possible time. Under the impetus of Qi Jiguang and other pragmatic officers, the wall gained tactical coherence, reaction capability, and robustness, enabling the Ming to contain, with varying success, the ambitions of the surrounding nomadic tribes. While the Ming Dynasty perfected its defenses, the world was undergoing profound changes. In 1453, the capture of Constantinople by the Ottoman Empire marked the end of the Byzantine Empire and disrupted traditional trade routes in the Mediterranean, thus prompting European powers to seek new routes to Asia. The end of the 15th century saw Christopher Columbus reach the Caribbean in 1492, initiating Iberian colonization on the American continent. The effects of these great discoveries eventually felt even in China, where the influx of foreign silver, notably Spanish silver from New World mines, triggered a notable rise in transactions and contributed to the growth of a monetary economy. The Ming participated partially in this global maritime trade, but the court remained ambivalent towards external relations, prioritizing internal security and the strengthening of land borders. The influx of precious metals increased pressure on the imperial finances. While foreign silver fueled the state's coffers, it also caused inflation that complicated the management of military expenses, particularly those related to the wall. In an increasingly interconnected world, the Ming Great Wall, erected at great expense, stood as a symbol of imperial identity, but also as a marker of discontinuity against an expanding outside world. After nearly 3 centuries of rule, the Ming Dynasty left behind, in the collective memory, the image of a proud China focused on preserving its territorial integrity. The Great Wall that travelers admire today, with its gray bricks, regular bastions, and breathtaking panoramas, largely results from these colossal works undertaken between the 14th and 17th centuries. It reflects the will to assert a visible border, both to deter aggressors and to display the power of a centralized state. Although its military effectiveness has been questioned by subsequent invasions, notably those by the Manchus, this wall still embodies the ingenuity and determination employed to unify and defend the territory. It remains, for many, a major monument of Ming historical identity, an imperishable legacy, certainly. In the middle of the 17th century, a decisive event marked the transition of the Ming Dynasty in 1644 to the new Manchu domination with the capture of Beijing in 1644, thanks to the opening of the Shanhai Pass, also known as Shanhaiguan. The political situation in China at this precise moment was particularly unstable. A rebellion led by the rebel leader Li Zicheng had already routed the weakened Ming imperial forces, forcing the reigning emperor to commit suicide to avoid falling into the hands of the insurgents. In the general confusion, the imperial capital became vulnerable, and General Wu Sangui, who was then commanding troops stationed at the Shanhai Pass, had to make a decisive choice. Either attempt to repel Li Zicheng's rebels on his own, or seek help from the Manchu army, which was stationed in the steppes to the northeast. This Shanhai Pass, located in what is now the province of Hebei, was one of the major strategic points of the Great Wall, as it connected inner China to the Manchurian region, where the future Qing sovereigns originated. The Ming had once reinforced this section to prevent any incursion from the northeast, as it served as the gateway to the heart of the empire. Yet, in 1644, the wall no longer stopped much. Although it had long been considered an impregnable barrier, its effectiveness ultimately depended on the men who defended it and their political decisions. General Wu Sangui, aware of the imminent danger posed by the advancing rebels, thus called on the Manchus, already unified under the banner of the later Qin Dynasty, who would later be known as the Qing. Led by the regent Dorgan, himself acting on behalf of the young Emperor Shunji, the Manchus responded favorably to the general's call. They crossed the Shanhai Pass, came to the aid of Wu Sangui's troops, and crushed Li Zicheng's rebel army. The latter, defeated, had to retreat hastily. In the process, the Manchus occupied Beijing and established themselves as the new ruling force. This turn of events sealed the end of the Ming Dynasty and the beginning of Manchu dominance over China. In fact, the role of the Great Wall at that precise moment was not to protect China from the Manchus, but rather to provide them with a military corridor, thanks to the complicity or decision of a desperate general. A sign of the very weakness of a supposedly impregnable wall, this episode shows that defensive power depends less on the structure than on the political and military cohesion exercised behind it. Beyond the initial conquest, the Qing dynasty from 1644 onward gradually consolidated over the following decades. The first Qing emperors, such as Shunji in 1644 and Kangxi in 1661, endeavored to extend their authority over the entire Chinese territory, ensuring the imposition of Manchu dress codes, such as the requirement for Han men to wear the Q hairstyle, a symbol of allegiance to the new order. From then on, the Great Wall was no longer the central element of their defensive plan. The Manchus were already installed south of the wall and no longer particularly feared invasions from the Gobi Desert or the Mongolian steppes, traditionally perceived as the greatest northern threat. Of course, episodic rebellions and local disputes erupted, as the Han populations often saw these new rulers as barbarians who had overthrown the legitimate Ming dynasty. However, the Manchu military machine, organized around what was called the Eight Banners, proved very effective in quelling these internal oppositions, as well as in controlling the borders. The Manchu banner holders spread into major strategic cities, consolidating the Qing's grip on the entire country. In this context, the defensive role of the Great Wall gradually fades. For centuries, various sections of fortifications were constructed, reconstructed, and then reinforced with the idea of blocking the path of nomadic powers. However, the victors themselves are precisely from these Manchu and Mongol confederations. One of the methods they adopt to secure their region of origin and to mark new strategic priorities is the implementation of a willow palisade system. This palisade, erected mainly in the northeastern region, that is, in Manchuria, the current Liaoning, Jilin, and Heilongjiang, signifies a deliberate intention to restrict access to this area, considered the birthplace of the Manchus and the potential engine of their power. The idea is not to build a gigantic wall of bricks or stones, like the one that snakes along the northern flank of China, but rather to erect a barrier of wood and earth, accompanied by rows of willows, planted to form a living fence. In addition to being a physical obstacle, this densely arranged vegetation serves as a demarcation, clearly indicating a border not to be crossed without authorization. The Willow Palisade serves several objectives. First, it contributes to the protection of Manchuria against potentially hostile incursions, whether Mongolian or from other border populations. Next, it also limits the migration of Han populations to the north, as the Qing seek to preserve their homeland and its resources, while avoiding a massive influx of settlers who might dilute or threaten the local Manchu majority. In some respects, it is thus a form of one-way barrier, repelling the movement of undesirable people. The routes of circulation, controlled by guard posts, remain few. Through this arrangement, the dynasty wishes to consolidate a sanctuary of Manchu power, to draw from it reliable military personnel, form new garrisons, and maintain strict control over the region. This policy contrasts with the traditional vision of the Great Wall, conceived as a defensive rampart against external threats. Now, the priority is no longer to protect inner China from the north, but to monitor the northeast to preserve Manchu ascendance. As the 19th century approaches, European maritime and commercial power grows rapidly, and China increasingly faces international-scale issues. The two Opium Wars, the first in 1839 and the second in 1856, the Taiping Rebellion in 1851, and other internal conflicts significantly weakened the Qing dynasty. During these troubled times, the Great Wall remains largely neglected and plays practically no role as a barrier against Western powers landing on the maritime front or against rebellions spreading within the southern and central provinces of China. Henceforth, the initial defensive function of the wall loses all its meaning in a world where new means of transportation, steamships, warships, and new firearms allow potential aggressors to bypass or quickly pierce traditional fortified lines. Meanwhile, it is in Manchuria that the Qing continue to exercise rigorous border control, less through stone walls than by means of mobile patrols and an administrative grid, supported by the Willow Palisade where it is still maintained. Thus, the military utility of the Great Wall is increasingly fading. Surveillance points remain, with some posts still occupied by small garrisons to combat local banditry or to maintain order in the most remote regions. However, the Qing emperors do not launch any massive renovation projects like their Ming predecessors did. The resources and energies of the imperial state are instead directed towards managing internal crises, the timid modernization efforts undertaken by the state to catch up with foreign powers, and diplomacy aimed at containing Russian and British ambitions in Asia. The Western campaigns, the Russian conquest of Siberia, and the colonial expansion towards Central Asia prompt the Qing to reassess their priorities, as defense is no longer limited to an isolated wall, but extends to international treaties, coastal fortifications, and a more global control of trade routes. The Great Wall, once a symbol of Chinese defensive genius, is thus relegated to the background. In parallel, a cultural transformation is taking place. In the eyes of the West and its exotic imagination, the Great Wall begins to rise as a wonder of the world. European missionaries, merchants, and diplomats, when they travel to China, hear about the millennia-old wall and its many branches. Some visit it, describe certain sections, and testify to its more or less dilapidated state. The accounts that reach Europe fuel the fascination for this titanic structure, which has become obsolete militarily. In fact, the Qing dynasty no longer has a fervent interest in keeping it combat-ready, and hardly promotes it to foreigners. Travelers, however, see it as a vestige of a bygone era, a quasi-legendary monument that would symbolize the unity and former greatness of Chinese civilization. In other words, just as the Qing are turning away from it in terms of military strategy, the Great Wall begins a new chapter in its history as a myth in the eyes of Westerners. It is no longer a fortification proving itself on the ground, but a cultural icon and geographical curiosity. Let us return to the Willow Palisade and how it fits into Qing frontier policy. Manchuria remains the keystone of Manchu power, and the government seeks to protect this region from the excessive influence of the Han populations. The Willow Palisade is obviously not an insurmountable barrier, nor does it correspond architecturally to the majesty of the Great Wall. Nevertheless, it is sufficient to control the flow of trade and filter the movement of people from the south. It stretches over several hundred kilometers, following lines of light fortifications, punctuated by checkpoints where soldiers verify passage permits. Through this measure, the Qing ensure that Manchuria remains a firmly anchored ethnic and political bastion. However, over time, with population growth in the rest of the empire and pressure on arable land, many Han farmers cross the palisade illegally or legally in search of new lands. Thus, corridors of colonization gradually form, mixing Han and Manchu populations in regions that urbanize as the Qing Empire advances toward the development of its northern borders. Even though the original intention was to forbid this massive migration, the demographic density of China proper eventually imposes on the imperial state a relative tolerance, or at least an inability, to formally stem the phenomenon. Additionally, Imperial Russia, whose expansion into the far eastern Siberia is increasingly felt at the time, becomes an additional destabilizing factor. The treaties of Nerchinsk in 1689 and Kyakhta in 1727 largely redefined China's northern borders without any intention of extending the Great Wall to the Siberian frontier. Instead, the Qing believed that their defense system now relies on active diplomacy and the preservation of a Manchu zone to the east, rather than extending massive brick walls. The very concept of the wall loses its meaning when the empire has to negotiate directly with powers capable of mobilizing modern armies or using other pressure tactics. From then on, a new defense paradigm emerges, based on a network of alliances, treaties, and port concessions like the Treaty of Nanking, granted to Great Britain in 1842, although it mainly concerns the south and the coast, and military gatherings more flexible than the static garrisons deployed along a wall. At the turn of the 20th century, the Qing state, already weakened by military defeats against the West, unfinished modernization, and internal uprisings, faces several major crises, like the Boxer Rebellion in 1899. This revolt mobilizes a coalition of foreign forces, including Japan, Germany, Russia, France, the United Kingdom, and other powers, which intervene militarily in China. Again, the Great Wall, located far from some conflict zones, does not hold a predominant position in the country's defense. Foreign troops penetrate mainly through coastal ports and push inland. Successive Qing emperors attempt to implement reforms to modernize the army, build arsenals, and train officers in new Western tactics, but these efforts often remain too weak or too late. Traditional fortifications like the wall can no longer withstand the artillery and repeating rifles of industrial powers. In the national imagination, the wall is no longer what it used to be. It no longer represents the ultimate barrier that no one could cross, instead becoming a moral symbol, a testament to the past. Thus, the legend surrounding its colossal proportions is reinforced culturally as Westerners discover it and as the Chinese themselves reinterpret it. Finally, with the fall of the Qing Dynasty in 1912, the result of Republican uprisings led by Sun Yat-sen and other revolutionaries, the Great Wall remains for a long time a monument to the glory of imperial China, an icon in the collective imagination, but devoid of any real defensive function. During the Manchu period, there is a marked reversal. The wall is indeed crossed and occupied by conquerors in 1644, but they gradually let it decay, seeing it only as a relic unsuited to the geopolitical realities of their time. The defense system shifts to Manchuria in the form of the Willow Palisade to protect the vital interests of a power that, paradoxically, derived its legitimacy from conquering a wall supposed to prevent them from entering. This historical irony illustrates well how the Qing dynasty eventually abandons the Great Wall while orchestrating new mechanisms of protection and control aligned with its strategic priorities.